We're at about 4 o'clock, and so I'd like to kick off today's program. My name is Robert Gropp, and I'm the Interim Co-Executive Director of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. For those of you who may be less familiar with AIBS than others, we are a federation of both individual as well as professional biological science and research centers spanning the breadth of the biological sciences. So we are both a membership organization as well as an organization that provides a number of fee-for-service programs ranging from peer review to scientific publishing, policy, education, the whole crosscut. So we are a vibrant and diverse professional community, and one of the areas that we've been working very aggressively is in the intersection of science and practice, science and policy, particularly as it relates to things like peer review. And you'll hear in a moment a number of the things that AIBS has been actively involved with in that frontier. But I want to first say that we very much appreciate those of you who have been able to join with us today for this important conversation. It's part of an ongoing Leadership in Biology series that we conduct on a monthly basis, where we have both podcasts, webinars, and periodically in-person meetings discussing any number of issues ranging from data policy and practice, data integration, the publication and access to data. Today's program is part of a series that we've been actively involved with related to the evaluation of peer review and the identification and development of best practices and standards for the implementation of high impact, very high quality peer review services, both from the publishing as well as in the grant making arenas. So again, on behalf of everyone here at the American Institute of Biological Sciences, I thank you. I hope that you will visit our website to learn more about us and also consider joining us as a member. These kind of programs are largely a result of the support or result from the support of our members. So with all that, again, I thank you, and I would now like to turn the program over to Dr. Stephen Gallo, who is our Technical Operations Manager for our Scientific Peer Advisory and Review Services. And Steve will share a little bit more information and introduce our speaker. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it. Appreciate that introduction. Again, my name is Steve Gallo. As Rob mentioned, I'm the Technical Operations Manager for the Scientific Peer Advisory and Review Services, or I'll refer to it at some point as SPARS. So if I throw that acronym around, you'll know. The AIBS has been conducting peer review for a wide variety of funding agencies and research organizations for over 50 years. And this has enabled us to actually look at some of the data we've collected from some of these reviews and to analyze it and publish some of these analyses in the literature to commit to the current growing body of research. We're committed to sharing results of these analyses as well as disseminating and promoting discussion about others' results. Because as I mentioned, this is a fairly small body of literature that is growing concerning the peer review process. Our goal is to foster a community-wide discussion that enhances the integrity of the peer review process that has served science well for so many years. So we ask everybody participating in today's program to join us in this endeavor. And so there'll be a question and answer period afterwards where we can ask the speaker questions. In terms of learning more about our specific efforts, you can visit our website at spars.aibs.org or follow us on Twitter at AIBS_SPARS for peer review news. We send out news on a regular basis, try to update the Twitter feed with peer review related material. We have a list of publications about the science of peer review on our website. It's broken down by the type of research and the topic, and archived and upcoming webinars. So with that little bit of information, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Michael Lauer. Dr. Lauer is the Deputy Director of the Extramural Research at NIH, where he serves as Principal Scientific Leader and Advisor to the Director of the NIH on all matters relating to substance, quality, and effectiveness of the NIH Extramural Research Program and Administration. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in Biology at Rensselaer Polytech Institute. his MD at Albany Medical College, a clinical fellowship in cardiology at Harvard Medical School, and a research fellowship in epidemiology at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute's Framingham Heart Study in Boston, in cooperation with Boston University. He spent 14 years in the Cleveland Clinic as professor of medicine, epidemiology, and biostatistics. And from 2007 to 2015, he served as the division director at NHLBI, where he promoted efforts to adopt a research funding culture that reflected data-driven policy. To this end, he has published several analyses in the last couple of years, I think maybe starting with 2013 or 14, I think, was the first one about peer-reviewed scores. But linking NIH peer-review data and productivity data, which is, I think, what he's largely going to speak about today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Lauer.
Great. Steve, thank you very much. And I want to thank you. I want to thank the American Institute of Biological Sciences for inviting me to give this presentation. I want to congratulate you on the outstanding work that you are doing. And thank everybody for joining late on a Thursday afternoon. So let me start by telling you a brief story. A few months ago, a number of us were rather intrigued by this article that appeared in PNAS that said, "Celebrating R&D expenditures badly misses the point." This commentary was written by two authors, Daniel Shapiro and Kent Vrana from Penn State University, and they lamented the fact that many universities advertise their research by speaking in terms of money. They say, our university or our department does $200 million worth of research or $500 million of research. And they said that this would be kind of like an airline saying, we spend more money transporting passengers than any other airline, or we use up more gasoline than any other airline. That leads me to mention one of my favorite airlines, which is Southwest. I was flying a Southwest flight to Arizona in January, and it was a rather long flight. So I wound up pulling up the magazine, the Southwest magazine. You know, these are the magazines that they put into the seat packet that nobody ever reads. And I noticed this intriguing cover. It's a picture of a stack of pancakes with a crab trying to climb it. I'm not quite sure what that means. But when I opened it up, there was an essay that was written by the CEO, and he said this: that the mission of Southwest has not changed since 1971. It's to deliver people where they want to go safely, on time, with their bag, with a smile, with low fares, and no hidden fees. Now, this may seem like a rather trite statement, but if you think about it, it's actually remarkably profound. And one aspect of it is that it is entirely quantifiable and verifiable. So let's break this statement down. We want to take people where they want to go. Well, what percent of people get to where they want to go on a nonstop flight? I was very happy that day because I was flying a flight which was nonstop from BWI to Phoenix, Arizona. Safety. You want a 0% incidence of major events. On time. What percentage of the flights are on time? Those data are to be found on the FAA website. With their bag. What percentage of checked bags are lost? With a smile. Now that may sound a bit more subjective, but one can actually measure that. The rate of complaints against different airlines is recorded by the FAA. And low fares. And that's obviously also a quantifiable and comparable measure. So if you think about this, there is a quantitative meaning and a quantifiable, verifiable meaning to what the CEO of Southwest says about what his airline is attempting to do. And by the way, I was very happy that day. I got to Phoenix. It was a nonstop flight. It was on time, and my bags arrived with me. So now the authors of this PNAS paper say that we should be thinking about research and measuring research in terms of a different finish line. The current finish line, you go from a proposal to the grant award and you stop there. But rather we should be going beyond that. Is the study completed? If it's a clinical trial, does it get completed? Are the results published? If the results published, do they generate citations? And this is what they call an optimal finish line. And I think most of us would agree that this is not an optimal finish line, but it's probably a better finish line than this one. An optimal finish line goes further. Better science, new ideas, potentially new products, better health. So another problem is that we need to be able to keep score. And this is nicely brought up by a book that I recently read by Phil Tetlock. Phil Tetlock is a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania who's interested in expert opinion. He is well known for having published a study in which he found that experts were less able than chance to predict future events. And so he talks here in this book about the art and science of prediction. One of his key points is that to know whether or not experts are doing a good job, you've got to have some kind of verifiable endpoint. You've got to keep score, and then you've got to provide feedback and see how well your forecasting system is actually working. And if you think about it, when we do scientific peer review, that's what this is. This is a kind of forecasting. We're trying to forecast good quality science. So how do we keep score? And that's the hard part. And some people say that it is so difficult to keep score, to know whether or not a scientific research project yielded impact. It is so difficult that we shouldn't even try. There's an extensive literature that's written on this. I found this one brief essay that was written by Johnny Anitis of Stanford University and Muin Khoury of the National Cancer Institute and the CDC. They wrote this piece in JAMA about a year and a half ago called Assessing the Value in Biomedical Research, the PQRST of Appraisal and Reward. And they argued that there are ways in which we can measure the impact of research, and they use this mnemonic. So P is productivity, which we'll focus on now. Q is quality. Now, I'm a clinical researcher by background. We have ways of measuring the quality of clinical research projects. There are standard criteria, for example, to identify high quality from fair and low quality clinical trials. R is replication. Can the study results be reproduced elsewhere? This is a very hot topic now at NIH. S is sharing. This could be, for example, the sharing of data, the sharing of cell lines, resources. T is translation, which may not apply for basic projects, but may apply for other kinds of projects. Now, when we think about productivity, one standard unit is publication. So, for example, for clinical trials, we want to know whether or not the main results of the trials are published. And then another unit are citations. Now, citations gets us into rather tricky territory. And this is something which has generated a lot of attention over the past few years when there's been more and more work done using bibliometrics to assess research outcome. These are two examples of papers that address these. The top paper is called the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics. Use these 10 principles to guide research evaluation. This paper appeared in Nature about 6 months ago. And then another paper by two leaders in bibliometrics, Lutz Bormann and Werner Max, How Good is Research Really? And both of these papers make a very important point, which is that you've got to be extraordinarily careful about relying entirely on raw publication or citation counts. The reason is that fields behave differently. They behave differently in space, and they behave differently in time. I'm a cardiologist. Cardiologists tend to publish a lot of papers, and they tend to cite papers a lot. And cardiologists will publish and cite papers at a much higher rate than, say, mental health professionals or mathematicians. It would be unfair, therefore, to compare cardiology output to mental health output, or cardiology citations to mental health citations, by simply doing raw citation counts. Similarly, there are changes over time. Many more papers are being published today than were published 10 or 15 years ago. Citation rates are higher today than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And so one has to take that into account as well. So in all the work that we have been doing, we've been focusing on field-specific metrics. So for example, we'll look at a paper and have that paper be categorized into one of, say, 250 categories, and then, or topics, and then that topic that paper is compared to all other papers that were published in the same topic in the same year and articles of the same type. So let's take a look at this. So here's an example. This is a group of about 7,000 NIH cardiovascular grants that were funded over a 30-year period. The x-axis shows the grant percentile ranking. The y-axis shows the number of top 10% papers produced by each grant. So again, a 10% paper would be a paper that is among the top 10% cited for its topic in the year that it was published, and for the type of paper it is. And what you'll see is that each dot here represents a grant, and what you'll see is there seems to be an association that as the grant percentile ranking goes down, in other words, it gets better, there appears to be a higher number of top 10% papers being published. Now, one of the problems here is that you got a huge number of dots down here, and each of these dots is completely black. There's another problem, which is that the way I set up this plot, I deliberately left out outliers. The highest number here on the y-axis is 50 top 10% papers per grant. And the problem is this does not reflect reality. If you have a plot that doesn't show outliers, you're not showing the whole story. So here's the whole story, perhaps. Here we include the outliers. So we got a few grants here that are producing 50, 80, 150 highly cited papers. And these are highly influential grants. Now, the other problem is there's not much you can say down here because you got a whole lot of black dots that are covering each other up in a rather small space. So how does one deal with this? Well, one thing we can do is we can make these dots much more transparent. So this way we can get a better sense as to what's really going on. And the other is that we can convert the y-axis to a logarithmic scale to represent the highly skewed nature of scientific productivity. So that's what we've done here. So again, this is the same data. We're looking at the exact same data. The x-axis shows grant percentile ranking. The y-axis shows the number of top 10% papers, but it's now logarithmically transformed. And we have dramatically increased the transparency on these dots. And what one sees now is that there is a much less obvious pattern of an association between grant percentile ranking and productivity. Now, there is an association, and you can see this here in the lowest line, this lowest smoother curve. Those grants that have the best scores are somewhat more productive than those grants that have less good scores. We do see that, but as Richard Nakamura, my colleague here at NIH, has pointed out, when you look at these kind of data, there is a great deal of noise. So now we'll take the noise out here. We'll take out all the dots, and we're looking right now just at the curve. And if we look at just the curve, we do see that there is this association. As we go up to about the 10th or 15th percentile, there is this gradient. Then it's pretty flat, going out to about 30, 35, and then after that, it goes down. Now, there's another important component to evaluating grants. It's not only the scientific merit, but it's also the budget. And so let me show you this. This is a group of several thousand proposals that were submitted to NHLBI all in the same year. The x-axis shows grant percentile ranking, and the y-axis shows the budget. This is also logarithmically transformed. And we find that those grants that have the highest budgets also get better scores. I don't think this is particularly surprising. Those grants that get better scores probably have more in them that gets the reviewers enthusiastic. We might now change our question a little bit and not ask how well does grant percentile ranking predict the productivity in terms of number of top 10% papers, but think about this in an input-output viewpoint. How many top 10% papers are produced per $1 million spent? So that's what we will see in a minute. Now, I forgot to point out this. So this shows the relationship between budget and outcome. So on the x-axis, this is the total award that a grant receives. On the y-axis is the number of top 10% papers. Now, we've logarithmically transformed both axes. So this is a log-log plot. And for some of you may be familiar with this. This is a classic kind of production plot. And what we see is that as the award goes up, the productivity goes up. That's what we would expect. But the productivity goes up at a slope of less than 1. What a log-log plot allows us to do is ask a question like, if I increase input by 10%, will that lead to a 10% increase in output? And if that were the case, then we would expect the curve to follow this. This dotted line. The fact that the curve is a little bit less than this dotted line and then actually gets even flatter tells us that we have diminishing marginal returns. Okay, so now if we rephrase the question, saying how well does grant percentile ranking predict the productivity of the grant per $1 million spent, now the association is essentially totally flat until you get out here. When the percentile ranking scores are getting poor, you can clearly see that there is a downgrade. Okay, now those are data for about 7,000 cardiovascular grants that were funded over a long period of time, over about 30 years. This is from a totally different set of grants. These are from grants that were funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health. Very different kinds of science, but we essentially asked the same question, which is how well does grant percentile ranking predict the number of top 10% papers produced per $1 million spent. What we did here was we divided the grants up into those that focused on applied research and those that focused on basic research. And we see a very similar kind of pattern. There is a lot of noise, a lot of scatter. There is a highly skewed distribution, which is why we had to use the logarithmic transformation. And there is essentially no association between grant percentile ranking and productivity per $1 million spent. Well, one can ask, is there anything that does predict outcome? Well, one item that does predict outcome is prior productivity. So this is another study where we looked at a smaller cohort of cardiovascular R01 grants, and we looked back at the number of publications that the authors had, that the PIs had published with NIH. So almost certainly this is an underestimate of their actual productivity. We logarithmically transform the number of prior publications. Again, this follows a highly skewed pattern. Most people had published relatively little, but there were a few people who had published a lot. And then we compared that to the efficiency of the grant measured in terms of the number of top 10% papers per $1 million spent. And what you see here is there is a nonlinear association whereby once you get above a certain threshold, the more publications that an author had produced, the more productive their grant turned out to be. This is another example that some people might say of past performance predicting future performance. Well, how do we put this all together? How do we put together these data that suggest that peer review may be at best a modest predictor of productivity? So Richard Nakamura and I I had the great pleasure of being able to work with him. And we put together this essay that was published in the New England Journal a couple of months ago. And we noted a number of important caveats. First of all, overall, the portfolio is performing quite well. There were 22% of all the papers that were published were among the top 10%. Now, by chance alone, you would expect that only 10% of the papers would be among the top 10%. So in this respect, the peer review system appears to be working. It is selecting out a group of grants that are producing a high number of highly cited papers, more than what we expected by chance alone. Another problem is that we only looked at funded projects. We didn't see what happened to people who weren't funded. A third problem, and this is particularly relevant for more recent times, is that funding rates are low. We're funding at low percentile numbers. Some of the pay lines for a number of the institutes are in the single digits or in the 10 to 15 range. And therefore, it may not be fair to say how well does peer review distinguish between an excellent project and another excellent project. Another problem is that there are interventions that occur after review. Budgets get renegotiated, specific aims get renegotiated, and so arguably what actually gets funded may be different from what the peer reviewers looked at. And then finally, what do we expect from experts? Experts may not be so good at predicting the future, but they may be quite good at assessing past and present performance, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. Well, one of the potential implications of this kind of work is that it tells us that peer review is helping us identify a large chunk of potentially highly productive projects, but that because of our resource limitations, there are many highly productive projects that we're not funding. So some people like Santangelo and these two authors from Jean-Michel Fortin and David Curry from Canada suggest that we ought to fund more projects. And the reason is that is inherent in the nature of science. So you might think of a scientific portfolio with many projects. Most projects don't yield very much, but you've got a few projects that yield an enormous amount. The payoff is absolutely explosive. Problem is we can't predict that it's going to be this project as opposed to any of these. So Taleb says that payoffs from research follow a power law meaning 20% of the input produces 80% of the output, with big near unlimited upside but limited downside. Since the winner will have an explosive payoff, the right approach requires a certain style of blind funding of as large a number of projects as possible. So one way you can think about this is that peer review is doing a nice job of identifying a large number of projects that have the potential for being quite productive. And what we need to do as a funding agency is think about ways in which we can fund as many of those projects as we possibly can. That's what Taleb would argue. Now, this is a slide that John Lauer put together. John is the director of NIGMS, and he notes that there are lots of problems with scientific research, including peer review, and scientific research sits in this ecosystem. And the problem that he'll argue is that many of these problems stem from the fact that we fund projects as opposed to people. And so, therefore, there is now interest at NIH in funding people-based projects as opposed to project-based proposals, and that's something that I'd be happy to discuss. Let me end by pointing out that a number of people are very uncomfortable by this kind of work. They argue that this kind of bean counting is not a good idea, that the whole idea of trying to quantify science is not a good thing. Jason Preen wrote a very nice essay in Nature a couple of years ago in which he argues that this criticism of discounting quantifying scientific impact, this is misguided. It won't do. Scientists, what we do as for a living is measure things, and we cannot argue that our own cogitations are uniquely exempt. The ultimate judge of scientific quality is the scientific community. These judgments are expressed in actions, and these actions may be measured. Citations represent a kind of action. When we cite a paper, that is an action that we take. It's a very low intensity action, but it is one. And there are a number of other actions that can be measured as well. I'd like to end by pointing you to the NIH strategic plan. An important part of the strategic plan is that we value and we recognize as an important responsibility the need to enhance stewardship of scarce taxpayer dollars. And our goal over the next 5 years is to excel as a federal science agency by managing for results. And I hope that you'll see some of the work that we have presented to you, even if you have criticisms about how it was done, that this would be an example of thinking about how can we best manage our federal agency by results. Many people are deeply disturbed that we do not know the best way to fund research. Johnny Anitas has gone so far as to say that it's a scandal that billions of dollars are spent on research without knowing the best way to distribute that money. And Pierre Azoulay from MIT has argued that we should turn the scientific method on ourselves by even conducting our own randomized trials. But the key point here is the more data-driven we make this discussion, the more rigorously scientific we make this discussion, the more likely it is that we're going to come out with an even better system than the one that we have now. So again, I want to thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation, and I would be happy to hear your comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lauer. I'd just like at this point to let the participants know that there's a Q&A function which you should have access to, which allows you to text in a question, and I can go through those and ask them accordingly as you enter them into the system. But while those are queuing, I have a couple of questions for you myself, Dr. Lauer. One of which was there have been some recent analyses of NIH peer-reviewed data, including just a couple of days ago, Dr. Ferric Fang's work from the University of Washington, and of course Dr. Daniel Lee from Harvard, who've had conclusions that either support or contradict yours in terms of the predictive ability of scores. So I was wondering if you could maybe address that.
Sure. So I'm going to go back to this slide here. So this slide is very similar to the slide that Daniel Lee showed in her paper. This slide is based on cardiovascular grants alone, but she looked at all NIH grants, and you saw a similar pattern here. And what she found was that among 130,000 NIH grants over a very long period of time, there was this gradient between grant percentile ranking and publications, citations, and some other measures. Now, I think there's several points to make here. One is that we also, looking at a somewhat different measure, which is looking at the number of top 10% papers, we came up with a similar result. There is this weak association, and it is actually there. The second is that that paper used raw citation counts and raw publication counts, which I mentioned during my talk is a practice that some people in this field criticize because it doesn't take into account different behaviors between fields. The recent paper that just came out from Ferric Fang took the data from the Daniel Lee paper, the exact same data, and they said, well, the Daniel Lee paper looked at the whole spectrum from the 0th percentile out to the 50th percentile or even beyond. The problem with that is that today, that's not our reality. Our reality is that funding decisions are being made from the 0th percentile to the 20th percentile. Right. And so therefore it makes a lot more sense to look within that specific range. So when they did that, they found that essentially the entire association between percentile ranking and outcome was based on the 0th, 1st, and 2nd percentile, which is a small proportion of the grants. And everything else, the association was relatively flat. So what this would argue for us is that it certainly would make sense to fund grants that get absolutely excellent scores, 5th percentile, for example. We're on very solid ground there. But when you get beyond that, when you get to 5th percentile up to 20th percentile, we might consider not relying solely on the peer review score, but considering other measures as well.
Right. But it does seem to support the idea that your peer review process, at least in terms of weeding out maybe not as excellent projects from the excellent ones, is actually working. It's more that it's harder to discriminate between the really great ones and the really excellent ones.
I think that's absolutely fair. Now, we don't have a counter. The ultimate counterfactual would be to say, some people have done this as a thought exercise. Let's fund some grants randomly, and not even look at them at all. And other grants, you would go through a system like this. Obviously, that's not something that we could do. Or fund some grants just based on fund everybody. Just everybody will get a little bit of money, and fund absolutely everybody. And that obviously is also something that we can't do. One thing we can say is that even if you want to criticize bibliometric measures, by bibliometric measures, the NIH system that we have in place and that we've had in place for a long time seems to be working well. We are producing high impact papers, and that's a good thing. Now, maybe we could be producing higher impact papers. That's not something that we know, but I think that is an important point to make in the midst of this debate.
Absolutely, thanks. I have a question. Can we evaluate different types of grant mechanisms against one another? For example, the quality of outputs from single investigator grants versus center-focused grants.
Yes, we certainly can. And that is a great question, and it is something that we are doing. So about a week or two ago, I gave a presentation to the National Advisory Council on Aging. This is the advisory council to the National Institute of Aging, and they had asked us to look at R01 grants and P01 grants. P01 grants are program project grants, so you might think of these as bigger grants, whereas the R01s are smaller grants. And we actually found something very interesting. We looked at their at a similar measure here, the number of top 10% papers produced per $1 million spent. And we found that overall, the PO1s are doing a bit better than the RO1s. The PO1s are producing more papers per $1 million spent than the RO1s. However, the RO1s were more likely to have some extremely highly productive grants that produced huge numbers of top 10% papers per $1 million spent, whereas you found a more compact distribution with the PO1. So you could think of the PO1s as being solid, reliable workhorses, and the RO1s as being the more lower cost, high risk, high reward types of projects. So we're going to be doing a lot more of that, and I think that's a fantastic question because it really does get at the heart of figuring out how we best manage by results.
Thank you. The next question, have you been able to study the relationship between peer review when including lay people or patients as reviewers and NIH grant productivity and impact? I know there's been some work, you've worked with PPI on some of this.
Yes. Okay, another fantastic question. So for NIH, I don't know. I was very lucky to have the opportunity to work with folks at PPI. PPI has a very interesting system of peer review whereby they include patients and non-scientist stakeholders in their review. We looked to see what was going on. We found that first of all, patients and stakeholders rank grants a little bit differently than scientists do. We also found, and perhaps this is the most important thing of all, is that all three groups, the scientists, the stakeholders, and the patients, moved their scores after they participated in discussion. So they all seem to influence each other. And so this may reflect the effects of bringing patients and non-scientist stakeholders into peer review is that it does appear to shape the conversation. The PPI folks are doing some much more in-depth work now than they had even done before, and that's something that we look forward to learning more about.
Interesting, thanks. I had a bit of a more general question, I guess, about how you envision measuring the impact of people-based funding versus project-based funding. The question is basically, when you expect that it would be just as hard to quantify people-based versus project-based?
So another terrific question. So some people have attempted to do this. The folks at MIT published a paper a number of years ago in which they compared HHMI researchers to NIH RO1 researchers. And they went through HHMI research is a kind of people-based research. They went through a rather sophisticated methodology to identify NIH researchers who looked like HHMI researchers. They found that the HHMI researchers were somewhat more likely to produce highly cited papers. The other thing that they found was that the HHMI researchers were more likely to produce papers that went off into different topics. One way you might measure how innovative a researcher is by looking at the medical subject heading haplotypes of their papers and see whether or not those haplotypes are changing over time. You might also look to see what kinds of co-authors they work with. An innovative scientist might be more likely to work with a co-author who has a topic profile that's different from their own. And they found that the HHMI researchers were more likely to do that. And perhaps the reason is because since they have more secure funding, and because their funding is not based on a specific project, they might be more willing to try different things.
Right. Okay. I guess the next one is how does citation rate relate to actual scientific work? You kind of discussed this a little bit. The research, for example, the research led to some tangible scientific discovery, such as a new drug, etc. It seems the citation is a poor proxy for determining the value of a scientific effort, fraught with a number of issues that are well published. What can be done specifically? What is NIH doing to improve how we evaluate the productivity of funded science? I think you've kind of addressed actually a lot of this already in your talk.
Yeah, so let me point out a couple of things. I would encourage you, all of you, this is you in the plural, I would encourage you to look at a very interesting paper that's posted on biorxiv, biorxiv.org. It's a paper written by my colleague here at NIH, George Santangelo, and his colleagues. George runs the Office of Portfolio Analysis. And this paper is about the relative citation rate, or RCR, which is a really intriguing methodology that he has developed for measuring field-specific citation rate. Kind of similar to what I showed you here, but using a different kind of methodology. Now, one of the aspects of it, one of the items in that paper is a comparison of the relative citation rate against measures made by experts. So they had 3 separate experiments where they had experts look at papers and grade those papers as being I don't remember, but good, very good, excellent, something like this. And what they found was that in all 3 of these experiments, there was a remarkably strong correlation between how the experts graded the papers based on their review and how this particular citation measure worked out. So that's one point I want to make is that there actually is some literature. This is one example. There's other literature as well, linking citation metrics to other kinds of measures of scientific worth or scientific impact. Finally, I would also like to point out an interesting paper that appeared in Cell last September on cure networks, written by a group at the Gladstone Institute at UCSF, where they put together these maps that lead to cures. So, for example, ivacaftor is a novel drug for treating cystic fibrosis, and they produced a map that went from the approval of that drug back to the trials that led to the drug, back to the thousands of scientists and institutions that were involved in the science that eventually led to the production of that agent, and the many, many, many thousands of documents. And they were also able to come up with ways in which they could identify the influence of various institutions and scientists. So there's been a fair amount of work that's been done in this area, and I think that this is like any other measure, that if you use it thoughtfully, there's insight to be gained.
Agreed. Someone asks, is reliability captured in any of your productivity metrics? I know you'd mentioned John Ioannidis' work, but...
Yeah, so reliability, I'm going to assume that by reliability we mean reproducibility.
I think so, yeah.
And so we don't know. And I think that is something that's definitely worth doing. What John has suggested, obviously we cannot test the replicability of every single paper that's ever been published. That this would not be manageable. But one suggestion that he had is that you might want to identify the most highly cited papers, because the most highly cited papers are presumably those that the scientific community finds interesting for whatever reason, and then see whether or not those results have ever been replicated. He's actually done some work in that regard and has found some mixed results. The psychologists have done fabulous work in this regard and have found mixed results. And then the next question would be to link that then back to peer review. So that's something that maybe, Steve, you and I can work on together.
Absolutely. Okay, one more question. Someone said that if you're using past productivity to predict future outcomes of the top 10% papers per $1 million spent, and you find there's a correlation, does it seem that large groups with excellent resources publish high impact papers and will be able to utilize monies from NIH better? And how would funding people versus projects look in that scenario? And then additionally, they mentioned about giving assistant professors given the fact that a lone assistant professor having a small lab can't do as much as a large team, I guess.
Yeah, so I think this is this gets to a couple of very important points. One is that if you're going to have a system, a widespread system of people-based funding as opposed to project-based funding, the system has got to be fair. And it would be unfair to put up a heavyweight wrestler against a welterweight. That would be grossly unfair. And so you might imagine a system in which you have highly experienced investigators competing against each other, and mid-level investigators competing against each other, and new investigators competing against each other. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best way to do it, but the key thing is that it has to be done in a thoughtful way. I think another interesting problem relates to diversity, the diversity of the workforce. The diversity of the workforce doesn't only apply to people, but it also applies to institutions. And a number of critics of the NIH have pointed out that a relatively small number of the institutions are getting a huge proportion of the money, and they have wondered whether or not that is necessarily the best way to disperse scientific funds. And so that's something that also needs to be carefully considered. And then the third issue is, what's the relationship between the size of a laboratory and its productivity? John Lorch has put out a terrific video on this, and if you go to either the NIGMS website or you go to our blog, the Open Mic blog, we actually go ahead and cite that, in which he cites literature that suggests that bigger laboratories are not necessarily proportionally more productive. And so that's another issue that we need to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Jeremy Berg, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, another question. Since one important output of grants is graduate students funded and trained, not just the papers produced, can we integrate that factor into an evaluation of the quality of the grant output?
Yes, absolutely. And where there is particular interest here is in assessing the value of our various training programs. If we fund a K grant, for example, we'd like to see that a substantial proportion of people who get K grants will stay in science. That could mean that they go on, the simplest measure might be, do they go on to get an R01? But we can get more sophisticated than that and ask other questions that relate to their staying in science as opposed to their giving up on science altogether and going into something else. For other kinds of training grants, we might want to see how successful are the trainees in developing scientific careers of their own. And so there is actually quite a bit of work being done on this. The NIH recently formed a whole new division on the biomedical research workforce. It's being headed up by Dr. Kay Lund. And this is a major focus of their efforts.
Great. Let's see, is there any solid study comparing traditional peer review versus an alternative way to allocate public research funds? For instance, like a one-to-one comparison. I presume what they're trying to get to is are there any prospective kind of trials, which I think I had a similar question as well.
Yeah, well, there may be. I'm not aware of any randomized trials where you compare one kind of peer review to another and then see what the outcome is. I know that a number of years ago, the National Science Foundation did a study in which they invited investigators to submit a traditional proposal and then to submit like a white paper, a brief anonymized white paper that would be reviewed by a different panel. And they found that there was rather poor correlation of scores between the two different kinds of review. Now, one thing that I understand they did is that they funded some projects based on the white paper alone. The astronomers have done something very interesting. They've tested a system of peer review in which people review the proposals of their competitors. So you could, this may sound like heresy, but you could imagine you got a pool of 100 researchers who are competing for 10 grants. So each researcher will review, each researcher that submits a proposal becomes part of the peer review panel. Each one is responsible for reviewing 10 of their competitors. You have a system in place that says that if we can tell that you're gaming the system, and we can tell that you're gaming the system, then we will dock your grant down. Your proposal will get penalized a certain number of points. And what they found is that the quality of the reviews improved. Of course, there were more reviews. Now, each proposal got 10 reviews as opposed to a more typical 3. And they also found that there was remarkably little gaming of the system. Now, maybe that's because the the agency went out of its way to point out that we're looking. We're checking to see whether or not you're gaming, and we have ways of knowing. But they used some rather sophisticated approaches to identify whether or not gaming was taking place. So it's another interesting experiment that's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there probably needs to be a bit more of that, actually. One of the things that you had mentioned in your essay in the New England Journal of Medicine was about looking at blinded versus unblinded reviews. Could you speak a little bit more into that? I know that there was a competition at some point by NIH, the CSR, for detecting bias and whatnot. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So there is, as Richard, as we mentioned in that particular essay, Richard Nakamura and CSR are doing a study on anonymization. And so the idea here is that you would have a group of grants that would be reviewed by standard methods, and funding decisions would be made by standard methods. But then as a form of quality control or quality assessment, what you would do is you would have those same grants reviewed by a different panel, and you would anonymize those grants. As you can imagine, this is not a simple study to do. You have to figure out how many projects do you need to review, what's the diversity of the projects. Anonymizing the projects is not so simple, but they are currently working on this. I think one of the most important points to make here is that Dr. Nakamura has clearly articulated that he wants to foster or nurture a science of peer review. He's not only running one of the most active peer review groups in the country or in the world, really, but also nurturing a whole science of peer review, and that is something that we very much want to encourage. I hope that this webinar that we're doing right now is part of that.
Absolutely, yes. I think two more questions. The first one was your NHLBI or BLI set is based on individual projects. However, sometimes investigators have more than one individual project.
Yes.
Have you broken out this analysis by total PI support?
Yes. So I believe that actually total PI support, now I'm not sure whether this was in this particular analysis or not, but we did include that as a confounding variable. You might expect that PIs who are better supported maybe will be producing more productive grants. So that is something that we've thought of. But it actually gets at another question, which is something that Jeremy Berg got at in his analysis, and John Lorch has talked about, which is total PI support and overall productivity. One of the problems is that if you have a relatively small number of PIs who are getting huge amounts of money, they may be extremely productive, but it also crowds out other investigators who may not be able to get funding at all. And so that raises a very interesting question about whether or not, as a metric, NIH should be focusing not only on the number of projects that it funds, but also on the number of people that it funds.
Right, like a Matthew effect metric or something. One last question. Can your bibliometrics detect differences in quality of peer review with funding rates? I presume you mean with different funding rates. So I presume if you had a peer review that had a very permissive funding rate, that whether the differences would be.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mean, I guess the closest you can get at that is you look at the natural experiment of the NIH doubling. So during the NIH doubling, because we had more money available, the pay lines got a lot higher or worse, however you want to think about it. And you could look to see whether or not there were changes over time in the ability of peer review to discriminate the most productive grants from those that were not. Now, we have not published it. I will tell you that we've informally looked at that, and we have not seen it. As we've seen that this modest level of predictiveness remains fairly constant over time. I think another problem is that there's so many other secular trends that are going on. We are publishing many more papers now at a time when pay lines are lower, and citation rates are a lot higher now when the pay lines are lower. So the best one can do is some observational analysis, recognizing that these are going to be highly confounded.
Right, I agree. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll probably wrap it up. someone asks, you mentioned this CSR study regarding anonymizing team names for review. Isn't there evidence from the National Academy of Sciences from back in the 80s suggesting that merit review panels often are not replicable with the same application pool? How would you control for that?
Yeah, so we are aware of that, and one way of doing this is by having different kinds of comparator groups, and so it's not just you have different sets of grants that get into the study, get sampled into the study based on different criteria, and in this way you try to get around that particular problem. It's kind of like we did an observational study a number of years ago in my former life as a cardiovascular researcher, looking at the outcomes of Jehovah's Witness patients who refuse blood transfusions. And we wanted to look at their outcomes after heart surgery compared to other patients. And the problem is, who do you pick as a control group? So the way we did it was we picked 2 or 3 different control groups. Fortunately, we came up with the same answer, and so we felt comfortable that we had a robust result. So I think that gets to the heart of doing a study like this. May sound simple when you first say it, but when you start thinking about the complications, it gets to be a much more challenging exercise.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, I think we're coming at the 5 o'clock hour. So at this point, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and participating, and to thank our speaker, Dr. Lauer, for taking the time to give his presentation. And just mention the fact that these programs are made possible in part through the support of our membership, and we encourage everyone to consider joining AIBS so we can continue hosting these types of conversations to promote robust peer review. So with that, again, I say thank you, and I guess we'll be posting up soon when the next webinar is occurring. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Dr. Lauer.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.